here we go. So Gabrielle Earnshaw is an historian, an archivist, a writer and editor, a speaker and scholar, specializing in the life and work of Henri Nouwen. She holds a BA honors in history from Queen's University and a master's of archival studies from the University of British Columbia. She has been the advisor to the Henri Nouwen Legacy Trust for 20 years and is consulted throughout the world on Nouwen and his literary legacy. That's, I think, Gabrielle, when we met about 20 years ago when we were researching the Nouwen trilogy, and you helped us so much. As the founding archivist of the Henry J. M. Nouwen Archives and Research Collection at the University of St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, I know she sorted and processed hundreds of boxes of Nouwen material that if you lined them up, they would be the length of a football field, including every check Henry ever wrote, every note, letter from friends, all his manuscripts and teaching notes. It's all there in boxes that she processed over the last 20 years. And among the boxes were 16,000 letters from friends and fans and 500 plus copies of letters he wrote to them. Henry had at least 1,500 documented friends with whom he corresponded or mentioned in his books. And of course, Gabrielle, I'm very proud to be one of Henry's 1,500 closest friends, but not in his inner circle. Gabrielle met Henry through his writings and is largely responsible for his legacy. She is the editor or co-author of 5 Nouwen books: Turning the Wheel, Henri Nouwen and Our Search for God; Love, Henry, Letters on the Spiritual Life, one of our texts; You Are the Beloved, Daily Meditations for Spiritual Living; Following Jesus, Finding Our Way Home in an Age of Anxiety; and the book that Connie mentioned, Henri Nouwen and the Return of the Prodigal Son, the making of a spiritual classic. Thanks for holding those up for us. And I have most of them myself. I think I'm missing, no, I've got them all. In 2021, Gabrielle was named the official biographer for Henri Nouwen by the Henri Nouwen Legacy Trust. She lives in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Gabrielle, and tell us a little bit more about yourself than I've introduced you with, maybe more personally, on your spiritual journey that might help us.
Okay. But I wanted to start, well, thank you, Michael. And I just want to say hi to everyone. It's really nice to meet you. This is the second time I've joined Michael in one of his classes. And I have to say, I'm just so excited because the last time I was here, it was good to meet the people who, I guess my people, the people who are also interested in the same things that I am, that for whom Henri Nouwen resonates like he has for me in my life for going on quite a number of years now, decades. So I just want to say thank you for coming, and it's really great to meet you all and to hear, you know, each of you doing your particular ministry and being part of a world of care that, and the world needs that tremendously at this point. When I was editing this book, maybe I'll just start with that, is Henri Nouwen received 16,000 letters, or at least he kept 16,000 letters. So those were the letters that he received, but what about the letters he wrote out, you know, to people? How did we get those? Well, we had to collect them. We had to write to those 16,000 people and say, would you be so generous as to give us the letter that Henri Nouwen wrote to you, or the letters? And many people did, and that's how I was able to create this book. We first had to go and collect those letters, and that took about a decade. And then it was from those collected letters, which we have about 5,000, that I was able to select for this book. And what I was trying to do is find the letters that I felt would speak to people's needs as they were in 2015 when I was compiling the book. And then today, when I was revisiting the book, it really strikes me that even though our world is different, who would have imagined in 2015 that we would be living in a pandemic or a war in Ukraine, or the global climate crisis at the level that it's at right now. And the question could be asked, does Henri have any word to speak into our times? Or have times changed so much that that we need new voices? And I guess I'm now the official biographer, so I clearly know the answer to that for myself. I feel that Henri Nouwen has a lot of wisdom to offer, continue to offer, and perhaps is even more important than ever for the 21st century person. And I have written other books, and each book has been a great privilege to do. But these letters, for people who haven't read them yet, I really recommend that you do. And it's not self-serving to me. I especially hearing the context in which you're living and the way that you're serving and the ministries that you're in. These letters, they run a gambit of themes. I mean, it can be a person who's just been divorced and is struggling with anger and an inability to forgive. But it can also be things like, how do I live in a brutalized world? I went through this book today because I was thinking, well, what happens if we, and maybe we'll get to this, read one of these letters? And I thought, which one would be appropriate? And I think perhaps today it would be one about how do we live in a brutalized world. So maybe we'll get to that. I'll back up a little bit and just say that I think what's important about me is that I didn't grow up in a religious household. So I came to Henri Nouwen very much a blank slate. I had been attending irregularly a United Church, but that's because a friend of mine invited me and I wanted to go for her. And then I was asked to, well, I wasn't asked, I applied for a job to arrange and describe, is the words in archives world, to arrange and describe the records of this man called Henri Nouwen, who I'd never heard of. So I like telling the story because it's quite inauspicious, and you kind of wonder. I feel like I'm an example of God works in mysterious ways, because I really did not come to Henri Nouwen as a theologian, as a religious person, but I did come to him as a seeker, and that's, I think, where our lives intersected, because I was trained as an archivist, and I'd worked for a law society. I'd been working for an institution that did good work, but it wasn't addressing my spiritual needs. And suddenly I was the archivist for Henri Nouwen, and my work became one and the same with my spiritual needs, with my deepest self. And what a gift that was. And I thoroughly enjoyed my work at the Nouwen Archives. I was there for 16 years. And yes, I went through those hundreds and hundreds of boxes, and many of them containing the gifts that you see in his books, or you can see in these letters. And so that was my world that I was steeping in. And then I was called, I was asked to edit this book, and this book of letters led to more requests to edit more of Nouwen's writings. And finally, I had to make a really difficult decision to leave the archives, and now it's in the capable hands of another archivist. And I'm focusing more on writing and editing, with a particular focus on Henri Nouwen. And that's where you find me today, just at the beginning stages of writing his biography, which is going to be quite quite an adventure. I think I've given myself 4 years to do it, because there's a lot of people, more people I need to meet, and more research I need to do. So I think that might be enough, Michael, as in terms of introduction to me, so we can get to the letters.
Yeah. Okay.
And the questions.
Sure. Well, let's do that. Let's have some questions, and then you can read one at some point as well.
Okay.
Rodney Kincaid, why don't you, since I know you're all prompted up, why don't you ask your question and see where we go?
Okay, sorry. I guess, to be honest, if I could just give a segue to this for me personally, I can resonate with what you expressed. I've been in ministry 20 plus years, have a master's, going into a doctorate program, and I don't say D-men because people look at me weird anymore, and because my enunciation sounds like I'm saying demon. And so I just say doctorate now.
I've got a demon in me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They're saying, you're taking what? So anyway, but I was not familiar. I had not run across any conversations or readings, literature of Henri Nouwen. And so being introduced to this class, I was like, okay, this is going to be fun. And of course we had like I think we have 5 books for the class. And so the very first one I picked up to start reading was the letters. Oh. And I have to admit, I was sitting there and, reading this letter critical, maybe is a word I should say, and opposed to reading it in a sense, in a feel kind of way. And so I ran across something that I kind of didn't line up theologically with. And so I was really disturbed by that one little nugget. And so I sat down with a friend of mine who is a big Henri Nouwen fan. She's on staff with me here. She's one of my staff members. And so we had this conversation. She kind of, I don't want to say talk me off a ledge, but she kind of expressed some things to me. And I finally started reading more then. I got past that point, started reading more, got into the books, of course, of Dr. Christian and his wife's books. And just to be honest with you, I resonate with 99% of what I've read now of Henri Nouwen. I'm a fan, I should say that. So I guess the question I have for you, I first off, kudos to accumulating all of this into a book form of some sort. I'm curious of, I guess, 2 questions. Why? Number one is why that 23-year period? You broke it into like 3 parts. Why that 23-year period? And was there anything before those 23 years that was significant or just wasn't able to be fit into a book or whatever? But I'd be curious to see how you came to the decision with all of this information to put it into that book form.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for all that background. And I'm glad you've come around to seeing that, you can disagree with Henri Nouwen and still receive something from him. I think he would be the first to say it's about, let's dialogue. Let's keep an open heart. And so thank you for that. It's actually quite a practical reason why I started the book in 1973, I believe. It's mostly because he only started really being attentive to preserving his archives around the time that he went to Yale, because up until that point he was moving around quite frequently, and It was also at Yale that he had his first administrative assistant. And when that happened, suddenly now he had someone who was filing his letters, and that's when his system got into place, which he then moved from Yale to Harvard, or to L'Arche, where he moved, it moved with him. So that's really what it is. The good news is that since the book came out in 2016, the Nouwen family has donated the letters that that Henri wrote with his parents and his siblings from the moment that he left Holland, which was in the 60s, till his mother's death, and then till his death in 1996. So that those are going to be a very important part of the biography. They're in Dutch, so they need to be translated. So, and that probably is another reason why there are fewer letters. I couldn't choose letters from the early period because they were in Dutch. I could have had them translated, but it just, I mean, I was already under some constraints about the length of the book anyway. So we decided to just start it in the Yale period. But it is a good question. And I think, you know, I'd love to do another book of letters and start it earlier. That would be fantastic. I've done a little bit of a, there's about 1,000 letters that his family wrote back and forth during the time that he was out of Holland, after he left Holland. And the letters, I had about 10 translated just to give me a sense of what they were like. And one of them was Henri Nouwen first getting to Kansas to go to the Menninger Clinic. And he comments on how big the pastor's car is, and he can't believe it, because that the minister would be driving this huge car. Why does he need this huge car? And I thought, oh, well, that's very, very funny, because we know that in Holland they are bicycling people, and so he was also commenting on the wealth of the minister that he was staying with. So those letters are going to be important. So that was, I'm not sure if you were interested in why I divided it the way I did. Was that a second part of your question? Yeah. Well, as we all know, our lives don't, while we're living them, we can't, they're just unfolding. And in a way, of course, Henri's was unfolding as well. But as a person looking at his life, I noticed that there were these sort of chapters, and now as the biographer, I'm actually reevaluating a little bit. I'm not sure if I would do it the same way this time, because I did it the chunk where he was at Yale, and then when he left Yale, he had what I called a crisis period. This is when he was really straining to discern God's will for his life, and then his sort of landing, his arriving at what he called home when he became the pastor for L'Arche Daybreak. So it seemed to be a nice way to divide his life. As I say now, I'm beginning to see that the death of his mother in 1978 actually is the moment that his life started to hit a real crisis that went on for several years and ended up, I believe, precipitating his decision to leave Yale and move and become a missionary in Peru. So I might, if I did this book again, divide it differently. But it did make sense at the time, and I still think that it's valid.
Wow. Well, I have follow-up questions, but I think I'll just see who's next. Who has a question?
Well, I'll go ahead and ask mine, if that's okay, Michael.
Please.
I admit I have not read the entire book. I've skimmed it. But as I listened to your story, Gabrielle, of how you came to this place of being involved in compiling and editing and archiving all of Henri Nouwen's works, I I was intrigued about this idea of coincidence. And, there was a time in my life where I thought coincidence was just that. And now I'm at a place where I think there are a few accidents or coincidences in God's kingdom. And my own place in today here happened very coincidentally by stumbling upon Northwind Seminary through one of my former Asbury professors, Steve Harper, who just put a post on Facebook. Oh, I just joined the faculty of Northwind Seminary. And after congratulating him, I said, Northwind Seminary, never heard of it. So I Googled it, and then to my delight, saw this program featuring Henri Nouwen. I had not been an extensive reader of Henry's. The first book of his that I read was The Wounded Healer, and it resonated with me. And then the next one was The Return of the Prodigal Son, which was required reading at Asbury Theological Seminary. But, again, I found that Henri just speaks in a way as though he knows you personally inside and out, and he's speaking to you personally. And that's not even through her letters. That's just through those two books. But my question is this. Did Henri do any writing on this idea of God's intersection in our lives, in what we would in the secular world say, well, isn't that an interesting coincidence? And whether or not, he wrote about God's intentionally intersecting with our lives at certain times of our lives to put us on a particular path.
I've thought about this a lot because I said at the beginning of the when I was speaking at the beginning, that I wonder now, does Henri Nouwen have resonance for 21st century people? And a lot of the people in my circle are secular, and Henri Nouwen doesn't speak to them at all. In fact, my family, they haven't read one single probably word by Henri Nouwen. So I'm actually swimming in mostly in a world of secular people. And so, of course, it's even harder for me to bridge that gap to be able to bring Henri Nouwen to them and to their what they're living. And the issue really is because God was such an intercessionary. God was intercessionary for Henri Nouwen. God was. And I'd love to hear what others think about this, Will and Michael and others here. But I believe that for Henri Nouwen, God was directing his life, and that what was required of him and all of us is to be so in touch with God through a deep communion, through prayer, daily, regular prayer, that you were able to listen to where God was calling you in your life. So his entire life was actually the listening to God's voice. And so for people who are understanding God now as God as love, or God as I feel like Henri Nouwen can't speak into that as well as for people for whom God is active in the world. That God is active in the world. And Henri Nouwen in the Genesee Diary, so that's a very early book of his, is already speaking about how his life is his life, as in all of our lives, is an expression of God's will. So it's yes, I would say 100% that Henri Nouwen would not ever use a word like, oh, that's a coincidence. Henry Nouwen was in essence at a persistently listening for where God was calling him. And I think in these letters, you can see where God is trying to help the people who are writing him to reach deep inside themselves and also be listening to God, so that he wouldn't be telling them what to do. He would be more encouraging them to go inside, reach into that inner room where God resides, and listen, really carefully listen, and from that point make decisions, make choices, make reparations, forgive, all of that. So it's a very powerful relationship that he entered into with God for his entire life. Never stopped it. Had lots of moments of I don't know, deep loneliness that threatened to derail him, but he I would say never lost the sense that God was active and present in his life and in the world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle.
Mhm.
Can I add a piece to that as well? That's such a great question and important. And some of us in the Nazarene program are reading Discernment book right now and finishing that book, and others in the North Wind probably have already read Discernment. But that's what you're talking about. Henry's witness to the possibility that we can discern the will of God, the guidance of God, through a daily walk, through a daily relationship, through a life of listening, and that's discernment. So I resonate and agree with everything you said about that, and would add that as a student, and he is my professor, he would talk to us about kairos, the word kairos, and chronos, so that in our life of chronos, a chronological life, we live our life in the here and now in chronological time, but God is always breaking through to us through his time, God's time, in a kairotic way. And so Henry believed in kairos, God's time, God's purposes, appointed time in Greek, so that you can attune your spirit in your heart to recognize divine appointments, next steps, people you need to see, pause and pay attention to, the people in your path. If you get up early enough in the morning, if you go to your prayer place of prayer, if you spend an hour with your Lord as he did, then if you do that daily practice, you become attuned and discerning of the signs of daily life that are given to you and given to us, so that we can act on them faithfully and keep our divine appointments. Mm-hmm. So it's a remarkable way to live. I can't do it every day. Apparently he did. Yes. And that's remarkable that he had that daily discipline. You know, as you know, even when he was traveling by himself in a hotel room, he would have Eucharist. He would have communion, right? He wouldn't miss his prayer time. Even when he was in the darkest pit, he still had a sense of God's absence or presence, absence and presence. And he didn't lose faith, even, I mean, since he was 6 years old, right? So all his life, from the moment he thought himself to be a priest at 6 to when he died, journeying with Jesus. So discernment.
That's right. And you know, in the prodigal son, which Connie mentioned, you know, Henry makes that wonderful insight among many in that book, that he says, all the time that I was trying to find God, I realized that God was trying to find me. And I was running around so much that God couldn't find me. So it's such a different way of understanding and holding our relationship with the divine. And so his insight was to stop running, stop searching, just go within, and God is already there. God is trying to find us. And so it really is this act of listening and creating space for prayer and Lectio Divina and all these different ways that our churches have for enabling us to be in communion with God as much as we can amongst the hurly-burly of our commitments and life.
Yeah. And the place that Henri did discern for himself and others, mutual discernment, and for himself, was in the letters he wrote, he answered, and in his journals, especially in his journals as he processed the signs or the coincidences. Alice, as you were saying, the coincidences of life could be reflected upon in a discerning way so that we can, as he says, suspect that God is at work, and maybe more than suspicion, maybe, a deep knowing. So thank you for that question and that answer. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Who else has a question?
I had the question. How did it come to pass that Brene Brown wrote the foreword? Because I think that's it just speaks, here's a person who, is celebrated, who's successful, who, and again, that's never enough, that will never, and I think that speaks to what we were saying before about, the relevance, to hear. So how did that happen, that she wrote the foreword?
Well, I had been a reader and follower of Brene Brown, and because I always felt, and I still think, that she's like the secular female version of Henri Nouwen. I really feel like they really have a similar interest in announcing, the sort of the gifts of vulnerability and the gifts of powerlessness, all of these the ways that you can flip what our society thinks are important, but actually let's think of it another way. And so I made the the request of her. I just sent out a cold call, and she answered it. And because my question was, do you happen to know Henri Nouwen? Right? Because I said, your writing it has echoes of Henri Nouwen in it. So have you been influenced by him? And the answer is yes. She had read Henri Nouwen, and she had been influenced by him, not to such a great extent that that's why she does what she does, but so she agreed to do it. And I encourage you, I hope you'll read the whole book now, because I really feel like every letter is priceless. And one way to read this book is like a devotional. So you just read one letter a day. And instead of thinking, okay, let's just get through this, read it one letter at a time if you want to. But another thing to read is Brene Brown's introduction, or what is it called, the foreword. Because she writes a letter to Henri Nouwen himself. She uses her imagination, and she exhibits through this letter a very profound understanding of who Henri Nouwen was, and why he remains why we should read him, why we need to read his letters. And it was just a real gift. And the final gift that Brene Brown did, in her generosity, which was not expected, is that she gave back the financial remuneration she received back to Sister Sue Mosteller, who was Henri Nouwen's great friend, who I dedicate this book to. And so she didn't even receive financial payment for her work. She didn't want to receive that. I also encourage you to read Sue Mosteller's epilogue at the end, because Sue Mosteller knew Henri Nouwen, and in the epilogue, she gives the most beautiful example of how Henri Nouwen did spiritual direction with her. And so if you want to sort of see how he worked, an example of how he worked, the epilogue is really quite good for that. Oh, and one final thing about Brené Brown. Recently, she posted, I think it was something like 5 of her favorite books or 5 important books, and Love Henry was one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that pretty amazing because it came out 7 years ago. So for her to remember that book is pretty fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
She did a podcast or a webinar, didn't she, for the Henry Nouwen Society last year? Does that ring a bell?
I don't think so.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I thought Karen was trying
I
to.
think I think the head of the Henry Nouwen Society has been trying for quite some time.
Yeah.
To get her, but
Not yet. Okay.
she might have already done her bit. I feel like she's already done her bit.
Mhm.
Yeah. But thanks for
Michael,
that question.
I
Yes.
need to go in a bit, but can I just say something?
Mhm. Please.
Well, first of all, Gabriel, in reference to Brené Brown, her thoughts and her concept of imperfection resonates very, very
Right.
deeply.
Right.
I'm not trying to be, self-promoting here, but that's the very first book I wrote,
Mhm.
Henri Nouwen, A
Yes.
Spirituality of Imperfection.
Yes.
And
I have
her
that.
thoughts on that are just like spot on.
Yes.
And very, very Nouwen-esque, if you will. But can I make a comment on
Here's Will's book.
There you go.
can I make a quick comment? I'd like to backtrack a little bit about the discussion earlier. I have a theory, and I haven't validated nor confirmed this, so I'm curious what you have to say. In fact, when you said earlier, when you made a remark, Gabriel, about a very famous statement of Nouwen that we don't find God, God finds us, or something to that effect. That sounds very reformed, as you know. And in the Netherlands, it's either you're Catholic or you're Christian Reformed. The Calvinist, in a sense, strain is very real. In fact, Nouwen's first approved biographer, Jürgen Bummer, was a Christian Reformed pastor. And my reading of Nouwen has always been there is probably that Augustinian strain in his theology, because it speaks very powerfully of like God's sovereign work and God's providence, that God is very present and active in a person's life. So I'm thinking, probably he's been, in a sense, his theology has been influenced directly or indirectly by this firm belief that really in God's economy, there's no such thing as coincidental, that everything is providential, everything is redemptive, everything belongs in the words of Rohr, and God is actively at work. That's just my theory. I've never been able to really confirm that. But
and he also says everything, all is grace. Everything is grace. Everything that happens can be received. Even the suffering can be received as from the hand of God, directly or indirectly. All is grace. I mean, I think he's got pretty strong feelings about sovereignty. I mean, Gabrielle, what's your take on that?
Well, I actually am very wary to jump into this conversation as a person who's never studied theology. But what I can say is, having studied Henri Nouwen a lot, is that Henri Nouwen was very Catholic, and I would say that he was, the mystics, I would say, were a very strong influence in his life. As well as the Eastern Orthodox Church. As I say, I feel unqualified to speak into this question, but my sense would be that any of these elements of Henri Nouwen's way of being a Christian that resonate with Protestants, or the Reformed Church, as you called it, would be because Henri Nouwen seems to reach right down past sort of all church politics, and then he goes down even further past church, underneath church dogma and doctrine, And then he gets down to where the mystics are, which is where, which is, I think, is where there's this great coming together, this great unity of it's not a unity of thought, it's a unity of heart. It's like he's an essentialist. That's, I would say that he gets down to the heart of things, and he's speaking heart to heart, not mind to mind. And Sue Mosteller, who I've spent a great amount of time with, she really impresses upon me and everyone that she speaks to that part of Henri Nouwen's genius was that he was able to connect the mind and the heart in a way that some people, that a lot of us can't, that we can't either. We're really, really strong in our conceptions and our understandings and our logic, or we're very intuitive and we're very, we lead with our emotions, and we kind of have this ability to read the world through our heart. Henri Nouwen had a greatness in both areas, and I think that's why I would say to your question, Will, which is a great question, that it would be mostly that he would be, if he was speaking to you, he would be hearing what's happening in your life, and he would give that freedom, and it would breathe, and so you would be, he would just listen to you and give lots and lots of freedom and space between what he's, his tradition and yours. And then that's why he cuts across the political spectrum. And yes, his biggest readership are Protestants at this point.
Yeah. And I'm not saying, by the way, that I was favoring that. In fact, when Michael was making a comment about all his grace and all that, I really see now in a huge integration and balance. It's like, that's why we always, whenever we say Henri Nouwen is our patron saint, it's because he's a centrist. He never goes left nor right. He's not a Wesleyan or a Calvinist.
Yeah.
He's always pointing people to the center. By the way, I just remembered somebody gifted me with an icon of Nouwen. Can you believe there is really an icon of Henri Nouwen? Anyway,
Yeah.
Gabriel, thank you very much, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Well, great to see you.
All right, thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
have a great day.
Another question from someone?
Oh, I think you're muted, Kathy.
Do you think it would be appropriate to say that part of it is because I felt in reading Nouwen that he really focuses on scripture, and so he's not focusing on theology. He's not focusing on interpretation as much as he points back to the words of scripture themselves. And perhaps a lot of theologians don't do that. They focus on their own interpretation. And I felt like part of why he's a centrist is because he's a biblicist.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, but I've got to challenge that a little bit, Kathy, because as a theologian, I don't think it's possible to be a biblicist without a hermeneutic, without an interpretive lens, without interpreting it. So I don't think you can just be a Bible church, for example. We just believe the Bible without interpretation. You have to have an interpretive key.
Right.
And Henri did. And Henri, of course, was high on scripture. He certainly said the book, the discipline of the book, is an essential spiritual director for us. We've got to be directed by the book, but also the church, and also the heart, the church, the book. And he didn't really put one higher than the other. He said they're all three essential. We have to have a community of faith. We have to have a heart that we go into to find God within, and we have to have the book, the scripture, the sacred scripture, and Lectio Divina is how God speaks to us, almost like a medium channel. So yeah, but his hermeneutic is the risen Christ, Spirit of Christ, and so all things get filtered through his relationship to the risen Christ, who he called the Lord. So yeah, he's a high scripture guy for sure, but I wouldn't call him a biblicist. Not that you can't disagree with me, Kathy. I'm just saying.
Oh, no, I was just asking. I'm
Yeah.
not stating. I'm asking
Yeah.
because I'm just observing for him. I mean, Gabrielle, I read the book cover to cover.
Oh, great. That's nice to hear.
And because it was for class, I read it cover to cover in a couple of weeks. And I have to say that one of the things I really enjoyed about it was to see his spiritual growth and to see how he learned and matured in the Lord, and to see how it seemed like they were, I don't know if it was questions as much as feelings that he seemed to express early in the book that he seemed to have more resolved later in the book.
Right.
And so I really enjoyed seeing his development.
Well, I can speak to that because I originally thought that this book was going to be organized by theme. So I kind of had my themes: social justice, death and dying, help me out, discernment, this marriage crisis. I thought it was going to be by theme. So a person who was experiencing death would be able to go to this section and see all those letters on death. Well, at one point I thought, this isn't working because it's jumping around in time. It's the chronological, and so I said to myself, this needs to be in chronological order. And it was a big deal because I had all my letters, they were all printed out, and I took a day and I spread them out in my living room, and I broke them out of their thematic organization, and I laid them out chronologically. And it was fabulous because suddenly I saw what you saw, Kathy, is that when you read them chronologically, not only were you receiving his wisdom on these various themes, you were seeing how he himself was growing because Henri Nouwen is one of those people, and I don't think he's alone in this, but he would often have to reread his own letter to know, for a problem he was experiencing, right? Because he could, he had these insights, but then to actually live them and to actually, integrate them into his life was a different thing altogether. And yet, when you read them chronologically from 1973 to 1996, you see that he is slowly integrating what he had been saying before. And I feel like suddenly the book was far more than just a book of letters that would help people through various types of crises. It was now suddenly a spiritual autobiography. It was seeing through time how a man of such great sort of sensitivities and conviction and perseverance lived his life and lived the very things that people were writing to him about, like crises, the crises of various things, like when he lost his own mother. Then it was, then he was able to think about how to be a spiritual director for people who've lost their parents in a different way. So it was I'm glad that you saw that, and I'm so glad that I changed it from thematic to chronological, because I think it made a big difference.
Great question. Thanks. And then great answer. Their C.S. Lewis letters too have a similar feel to them. In chronological helps them, helps that huge number of letters in C.S. Lewis's corpus. I think 4 volumes now. So I hope you do more volumes of the Nouwen letters, because there's a lot to mine there.
I think there's a sense in which over the years, as we teach ourselves into the truth. And so it felt like there was a sense in which he was writing himself into the truth.
That's very true.
That he was more and more convinced of it. His language became more and more convinced of certain truths as he kept writing it to people.
Yes, and through his books as well. Like Michael said, he wrote, he published 3 journals, so he processed almost everything through his pen. He was, when we were talking about whether he was a biblicist or all that, I was thinking to myself, what was he? He was not a theologian. And I think he'd be the first. It's actually, there's a letter in this very book that says, "Don't call me a theologian." But what was he? And I think he was, and I'm going to be struggling with this in the official biography. Was he a writer first and foremost? Was he an artist first and foremost? Or was he a priest first and foremost? Now, he called himself a priest in the classroom. So even though he was at the highest centers of learning, Yale, Harvard, Boston College, Notre Dame, he considered himself a priest in the classroom. So his identity, his main identity was not as a theologian, or even I think as a professor. I think I imagine that he's thought of himself as a teacher, but seeped in his identity as a Catholic priest. But I'll be grappling with that, because in a way we could also say that first and foremost he was an artist, and that he actually approached his life like an artist, in that it was, this blank canvas. He did actually speak a lot about our lives as a canvas that we're painting our lives on. And so there's a sense that he, and the way that he was so adventurous in terms of his choices. A lot of, like, for me to leave the university, that was obviously a big choice. And I think it took me 2 years to finally say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take a chance with my life, and I'm going to switch gears completely. Well, Henri did that over and over and over again. And I believe it's because of that artistic temperament. He wanted to express himself in new mediums, in new venues, new contexts. He was extremely adventurous. And I think that was that artistic temperament, that desire to express himself through these various mediums, writing being a primary one, speaking, sermons, spiritual direction. But I think it was also just in how he lived his life. This, who did he bring into his life? Who were the friends? Where did he put his time? And he did it all very consciously. And he packed a lot into his life.
You're onto something there for sure. And I think Henri identified with Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci, and the anguish of Van Gogh. He identified in that with that artist temperament and that pathos and that despair as well. Mm. So yeah, Henri the artist. I guess he wanted to be a trapeze artist, right?
He did at the very end of his life. He gets enthralled with these trapeze artists, and I think it has everything to do with this, that he was seeing in them what he had been trying to do his whole life, which was to just step off the platform, just trust that bar is going to be there and just go for it.
No.
And I mean, that speaks, I guess, back to our first question about, God's active presence in our lives. And Henri, Henri believed in this, had such faith, deep faith, that's how he lived his life, like a trapeze artist.
Yeah. And he had so many art books, in his library, just lots of artists' books, pictures, and commentary. So yeah, I think you're on. Of course, he called himself a priest, hyphenated priest, right? He called himself a hyphenated priest -- psychologist. He didn't over-identify as a professor. He didn't over-identify as a pastor even, but priest was big, and hyphenated priest is what he called himself. But artist is probably where you can end up. I don't know.
And also writer, because I think he really, this idea of taking his experience of life in all its fullness, and then distilling it down through this lens of where is God active in my life.
Yeah.
He was a communicator. This wasn't something that he was just doing for his own sort of self-interest or curiosity. This was something that one of his maxims was to lay down your life for your friends. His main sense of ministry was a minister is a person who lays down their life for their friends.
Yeah.
And meaning that his life, how he lived it, the struggles that he had were meant to be shared, because what is most personal is the most universal. And so he had this gift of being able to find the words that drew people to his books because they were so non-judgmental. They were so non-denominational. There were so many ways he could have expressed himself, but he chose to do it in this very simple, I always think of it like sort of in a Zen way. Like he could distill something that he could have expressed it through very Catholic wording or Protestant, or but he chose actually very carefully his words that were the most open, the words that people didn't get tangled up on, that people didn't get hooked on and say, oh, that isn't the way I understand it. He tried to find words that were open and that didn't have all that history and baggage attached to them. And I think that was extremely conscious on his part.
Yeah.
To try to reach as many hearts as possible.
Would you say that he's something of a romanticist, and in terms of how he writes with full emotion and passion and expresses it? And even as an artist, even though Rembrandt and Van Gogh we don't classify them as in the romanticist genre of painting, he just seems to me like he communicates like a romanticist in terms of the fullness of his passion.
Well, I think of him, I haven't thought of him as a romanticist, but I have thought of him as I've really considered this question of why do some people not resonate with Henri Nouwen? Because there certainly is a large contingent of people like that. And I think it has something to do with that he speaks about feelings a fair bit. And feelings are well, certainly people don't expect to be talking about feelings that much in a university setting. And there he was speaking about feelings. He also, I wanted, and Michael, you might remember this, but that he liked to speak about Jesus. It's not that he liked to, it was that Jesus was, as he said, the center of his experience, that his life centered on Jesus. That's why he said the Eucharist every day. And in a university classroom, even at some theology schools at Yale and Harvard, it wouldn't have been actually all that well received to speak about Jesus directly.
Yeah.
And yet Henri Nouwen did do that. And so in a way, I see that as very, again, sort of he's swimming against the current there. It would have been better to sort of speak about Jesus, but not speak about Jesus in a way that Jesus is his Lord, that Jesus, the way that he did.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Absolutely right. Even though at Yale, I was as an evangelical Christian who's very Jesus-centered, Christocentric, I was a little bit put off originally when he would use so many Zen stories and connected to other religious traditions. And I had not had any professors or pastors who did that before Henri, who would give us a koan or a Zen story to begin his, a parable. Yeah. So that I didn't quite know where he was coming from, but then he was Christocentric in everything else he did, including every class was centered around a gospel. At Yale, it was the Gospel of Luke. All his courses when I was there in 1979 to 81, at Yale, it was the Gospel of Luke. and he connected to the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. When he got to Harvard, it was the Gospel of John, and he switched Gospels a bit at Harvard. But when I visited him at Harvard, he told me he was having a really hard time staying at Harvard. He says, because here at Harvard, people tend to think of God as an idea. And of course, he wanted to pray to a person and be with a person of Jesus. And he had a hard time finding at Harvard people to pray with him or to think of God anything other than idea. And so he really struggled at Harvard more than he struggled at Yale. But this Christocentric piece of Henri is very, very strong. Jesus as Lord of his life. And of course, Gabrielle, I'd love to see how you handle the near-death experience that he had when he was hit by the mirror of that van in Toronto, or at daybreak, because his testimony says on that gurney, on that hospital table, he saw Jesus. He met Jesus, who said, "You can't stay. You got to go back. There's more for you to do." So, what do you do with that near-death experience of Jesus? And did that change his life at that point?
Oh, that changed his life. That's one. I mean, Henri Nouwen had many, significant pivotal moments. I would say more than other people, but that is absolutely one of the most. It's where he was ready to die. He was actually he died. He wanted to die. He was like, I'm fine with dying, and he was actually disappointed that he had that he actually didn't die. And so I'm not sure if it's a letter in here, but there in one of his books, perhaps Our Greatest Gift, that book, he writes about how people were saying, "Oh, Henri, it's so wonderful that you didn't, that you're better," and he said interiorly he didn't know what to do with that, because he was feeling actually disappointed. But after that moment, his certainty that he was the beloved child of God was no longer just an aspirational, I really hope this is true, sort of thing to say. It was something he actually started living. It was an extremely important moment. That was in 1989. So that I think you can trace some changes that happened after 1989, after that near-death experience.
I hear two things from what the two of you are saying. One is, it's very common with the near-death experience for believers to come back disappointed that they're back, because it's so much better there. And the other is, I think it's significant, Michael, what you said about that he struggled at Harvard because there were people who were relating to Jesus as a concept. He very much relates to Jesus as a person.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately, there's so many theologians at the Harvard Divinity School level, okay, who relate to Jesus as a concept and only the historical Jesus and so on, and do not relate to him as a person in that sense. And so that's another thing about Nouwen that I noticed, is that he's so in love with Jesus as a person. He's not in love with a concept. He has a relationship with a living, breathing person. And I would think that near-death experience would only serve to confirm that to him, that, oh my goodness, I actually have been right all along. He's really out there, even though I have people who keep telling me he's really just a concept and you're making him up in your mind and all these different God concepts. He's coming back going, no, I was right. This really is a person. And you would think that would just solidify things for him and change it and make him more sure and more positive in that sense.
Okay, so look, I'm going to have to leave it here because our time is up, and I'll refer you for more Jesus and Christocentric spirituality for Henri to Robert Jonas's introduction to discernment. In his introduction to our book on discernment, Henry's book on discernment, Robert Jonas goes at length to talk about why Jesus is so important for Henry, and what Jesus, the risen Jesus for Henry, is his hermeneutical key, if you will, more than a concept, but a person. So thank you for bringing that out. And Gabrielle, thank you for being with us today. We didn't get all our questions asked or answered because we're disciplined on time.
Yeah.
But you know, blessed Holy Week to you and to all of us. And as Henry would,
there's some letters for Holy Week in the
there
book.
you go.
Yeah.
As Henry would say, Holy Week is a season of the church year, one of the 7 seasons of the church year. And we have 7 seasons to connect our individual spiritual lives to the life of Jesus. So history, his story, and our story connect through this church's seasons of the year, Holy Week being a big one, and with the story of Christ in the scripture. So let's be holy, let's do Holy Week and Eastertide. So thank you, Gabrielle. And
Okay, well, thank you, all of you.
Down the road, and all of you will see you on Zoom at some point.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Blessings this Holy Week.